The great rabbi of the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the link to Memphis is that he asked Mrs. Wax out on a date at the Hebrew Union College, but she turned him down and said, "You probably would be better with someone else," and he ended up marrying a wonderful person. The other link is that he marched in Selma with the great Rabbi Ari Becker of Beth Shalom Synagogue. And Rabbi Heschel was the one who said, when it comes to amazing things, coincidences, they're really not coincidences. It's really God's way of remaining anonymous. And I'm feeling kind of that way as I prepare to share what one of my dear friends calls my book report each week, my sermon, which really is, this week, a book report. I was a TA for Jonathan Sarna, who went on to Brandeis University, a preeminent American Jewish historian, and he wrote a book called Lincoln and the Jews. And what inspired me to finally read it was the passing of two veterans. And I'm looking at two veteran members of our cemetery committee, Dick Eastman and David Rosenthal, longtime officer, who erected at our Temple Cemetery, which is the most beautiful synagogue cemetery in America. I'd say that even if I didn't live here. There is now a Veterans Memorial, if you haven't seen it, recalling all the members of our congregation starting in 1914. The youngest casualty in World War I, as far as we know, was from Yazoo City, Mississippi, and a member of this congregation lied about his age, served in World War I at like age 14 and a half, and died. And it goes all the way through 2014 when we, in the sanctuary, had the memorial and funeral for Robert Secher. We all know about President Lincoln and how his lifetime coincided with the emergence of Jews on the national scene in the United States. But here's what we don't often remember. When Lincoln was born in 1809, scarcely 3,000 Jews lived in this entire country. By the time of his assassination in 1865, this temple was founded in 1854 because of the immigration from Central Europe and not Eastern Europe, which happened in the 1880s. So many Americans, including members of Lincoln's cabinet and many of his top generals during the Civil War, were alarmed by this development of all these Jews coming to America, 3,000 to 150,000. And they treated Jews as second-class citizens and religious outsiders. And what Professor Sarna documents in this book is how Lincoln exhibited precisely the opposite tendency. He not only had a deep knowledge of the Torah, and I'm going to link it to tonight's Torah portion, he also employed the language of our people in not only his most important writings, but his lesser-known writings. He befriended Jews from a young age. He promoted Jewish equality. He appointed numerous Jews to public office. He had Jewish advisors and supporters starting from the early 1850s. And the year this temple was founded, in 1854, was the first time he spoke out against slavery in his Peoria speech. He changed the rhetoric of what this nation was. It used to be called a Christian nation. He's the one who changed the rhetoric to calling America this nation under God. On April 9th, 1865, just one day before Jews sat down to observe Passover at the Seder, commemorating our own passage from slavery to freedom, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Grant in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And 2 days later, just as many Jews in this congregation were sitting down to their seders. The second night, Abraham Lincoln delivered what would be his last public address. He acknowledged God from whom all blessings flow. He called for the enfranchisement of a select group of African Americans. A young pro-slavery actor named John Wilkes Booth heard his speech and vowed that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever make. And so on Friday night, April 14th, the start of the 5th day of Passover, Booth made good on that threat and shot Lincoln during a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Charles Lieberman, a Russian-born Jewish surgeon who was president of the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, was one of the doctors who spent the night trying to save Lincoln's life. At 7:22 on the morning of Saturday, April 15th, Lincoln passed away. And since numerous Jews were either in synagogue or on their way when word of his death became known, many of the first prayers remembering President Lincoln were Jewish ones. There's no doubt that of all the presidents, perhaps the one loved the most is Abraham Lincoln. We revere him for many reasons. One is that even though he did not belong to any church, he was surely the president with the most authentic faith. His second inaugural address is probably the most profound religious statement ever made by any president. We revere him for his capacity to work in harmony, even with his team of rivals, his most severe critics, and for his ability to forgive those who maligned and mocked him during his years in public office. And we revere Lincoln for the capacity he had for compassion that he showed so many times. And that's what I want to share with you tonight of all the stories in this book, because it relates to this week's Torah portion, Deuteronomy 16-21, Shoftim. In this week's portion, there is a list of military deferments, the grounds for not fighting in a war. It says, literally in the Torah this week, that anyone who has planted a vineyard and not enjoyed its produce, go home. Anyone who built a house but hasn't gotten to spend the night in the house or lived in it, you get a deferment. Anyone who has gotten engaged but not yet married or had your marriage should be deferred from going to the army. And then there's a fourth category. It says that anyone whose heart is afraid shall also go back, lest the courage of your comrades flag. Someone whose heart is just not in this war, someone who is afraid, is excused from the army or the Navy or the Coast Guard or the Air Force, is excused so that he or she does not affect the morale of other soldiers. And so, that this man shall not be disgraced, he's counted together with those who are deferred because they had started something, a home, a vineyard, an engagement, and not finished it. Think about it. Think about the humanity behind this passage. A soldier who does not want to fight should not be made to fight, and you include him with others rather than treating him as a coward so that you can preserve the human dignity and not disgrace him. That's what the Torah says. Now listen to the relationship to Abraham Lincoln. True story. During the Civil War, a young man named Roswell McIntyre was drafted into the New York Cavalry. The war was not going well for the first 2 years. Soldiers were needed so desperately that they were sent into battle with little or no training. Roswell McIntyre was one of these soldiers. He was rushed into the front lines before he was really ready. He panicked and he ran away. McIntyre was found, court-martialed, and condemned to be shot as a deserter. McIntyre's mother appealed to President Lincoln directly for clemency. She pleaded that her son was young and inexperienced, and that he deserved a second chance. The generals, however, urged the president not to grant this man a pardon. They argued that if he granted a pardon, it would weaken the discipline of the entire army. If this young man could do that, desert, the generals feared that other soldiers would do the same, and that would be the end of the discipline on which every army depends. Lincoln listened to the pleas of the mother, then he listened to the arguments of the generals, and then we're told that he thought and he prayed. And then he wrote out a pardon for Roswell McIntyre. And in it, he wrote this statement, and I quote, "I have observed that it never does a boy much good to shoot him." He wrote the pardon out in his own handwriting. And in it he said, "This letter will testify that Private Roswell McIntyre is to be readmitted into the New York Cavalry. And when he finishes his required period of duty, he shall be cleared of any charges whatsoever of desertion," end quote. If you don't believe me, that faded letter signed by the president is now on display at the Library of Congress, and beside it is a brief note that says, and I quote, "This letter was found on the body of Private Roswell McIntyre, who died in the Battle of Five Forks, Virginia. Given a second chance by the kind-heartedness of President Lincoln, Roswell McIntyre fought bravely until the end." Did Lincoln have this week's Torah portion in front of him about those who are entitled to a deferment in mind when he issued this pardon? Who can say? I know him as a reader of the Bible. We don't know. But what Lincoln does illustrate is the truth that it is always good to give a person a second chance, especially when the person is young. As Lincoln put it, "I have observed that it never does a boy much good to shoot him, but it often does a boy much good to give a child a second chance." With only weeks away, my friends, from Rosh Hashanah. 3 weeks, that's it. The most important month in the Jewish calendar for self-examination, self-correction, self-reflection. Each of us faces the question of how to improve ourselves, as well as how to judge our fellow human beings, especially the foreigner, the stranger, not just the people in our lives. Each of us at some time in our lives has to confront the question of whether to forgive a person who has done wrong and whether to give that person a second chance or not. The temptation is almost overwhelming to do what the generals wanted to do. If a person has broken the law, let him pay the full price for his misdeed. If not, what will happen for respect to the law if we don't show mercy? That's the argument Lincoln made. There's the power of compassion, which says that there are some times when we must go beyond the law for the sake of mercy. Lincoln understood that, and so should all Jews and all people. He chose the Union over everything else. We know about the big and difficult decisions in his presidency, so he went to war to preserve it. He chose the equal rights of human beings over other things. He cared about how to reunify the country after the war, and that's why he spoke in his second inaugural address of how, and I quote, you know this by heart, "With malice towards none, with charity towards all, we should go forward to care, to bind up the wounds of our soldiers, and to care for their widows and orphans." There is a long list of difficult and painful decisions that we all must make in our lives and that he had to make in his short life. I think one of the best, perhaps one of his best decisions, is the case of Private First Class Roswell McIntyre, and one that we should remember as we approach Rosh Hashanah. It's a decision based on this week's Torah portion, where we are to lump those who need mercy and compassion with newlyweds and home builders and vineyard producers. A decision that shows both wisdom and the compassion of our Torah and our 16th president hundreds of years later, kind-heartedness, a move infused with Jewish wisdom, compassion, and human dignity. And let us say,